Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on mental health in religious communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. I am Brandon Vaidyanathan. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, 1 in 5 Americans were experiencing mental illness every year. And the pandemic is causing a global mental health crisis, according to the United Nations. Now, 1 in 4 Americans have been reporting mental health struggles since the pandemic. In the United States, faith communities tend to be the first recourse for many Americans with mental health struggles. We also know from considerable research that there are significant mental health benefits to religious participation. However, the pandemic has imposed all sorts of restrictions on faith communities in terms of their activities and even forcing many of them to close their doors. And so it's really crucial to understand during this time how the pandemic has affected religiosity as well as mental health in faith communities, especially since religiosity tends to be a buffer against many of the negative stressors that people experience. And that's going to be the focus of our event today, and I'm delighted to share with you the results of some research that we've been doing. Before we begin, I want to thank the John Templeton Foundation for their generous funding of this research project. I also want to thank our webinar hosts, the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America, which exists to educate university students, to give the Republic her best citizens, to sponsor multidisciplinary academic research on the intersection of human flourishing and Catholic social doctrine, and to organize events encouraging conversation between the Academy and the public square. Last but not least, I want to thank my research associate, Christopher Jacoby, for the data analysis in this presentation. So here's the order of the day. I am the brown guy on the left of your screen, and I will present the results of our study. And this presentation will be followed by 4 responses. First from Scott Thuma, who is Professor of Sociology of Religion and Director of the Hartford Institute for Religion Research at Hartford Seminary. Elisa Gilmore, who is Director of Mental Health Support Ministry at First Baptist Church of Glenarden. Lisa Ziv, who is Chief Strategy Officer and Interim Executive Director of the Blue Dove Foundation, and Mark McMinn, who is Professor Emeritus and Scholar in Residence at the Graduate School of Clinical Psychology at George Fox University. I'm very grateful for their presence on this webinar, and their full bios should be posted in the chat. At about 4:45 Eastern, we should have time for Q&A, and again, the instructions for how to ask a question will also be posted in the chat. So to get started, this project is based on a survey of 12 faith communities that we conducted between October and December of 2020. More than 1,600 participants took the survey, and these were surveys that were sent out by the leaders of these communities that we contacted. We contacted a lot more communities. I think we contacted a little over 30 communities, and 12 of them agreed to participate. And so we have a number of Catholic, Jewish, that is Reformed Jewish, as well as Orthodox Jewish, Evangelical, African American Baptist, Latter-day Saints, and Hindu communities who participated in the survey. The sample is based primarily in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. About close to 80% of the participants are from this region, and a little over 20% from Texas. And we also conducted additional interviews with some of the leaders of these communities, as well as in Muslim, Buddhist, and Sikh communities. Now, they did not take part in the survey, and today's presentation will only focus on the survey results. A little bit about our sample. The sample is not a representative sample of either these faith communities or a national sample. It's based on those who took part in a survey that was sent out by the leaders of these communities. And so understandably, it skews towards those who are more active in those faith communities. And they tend to be older, female, married, predominantly married, and with higher education and higher income. Now, we conducted a previous set of studies, both in Texas as well as in the DC area in 2017 through 2019. And we found in those studies, both in Texas as well as in the DC area, very similar demographics. And so there must be something about who responds to a survey that is sent out by a faith leader and who is really active in faith communities. The leaders we talked to from these congregations did say that this demographic seems to reflect the people who are quote unquote in the pews. So these are folks who are regularly involved. And so while we don't have a nationally representative sample, a couple of advantages. We have a large sample size. Our race ethnicity demographics are close to the national population in the US. And also this tends to be reflective of, in the leaders' opinions, folks who are very active in their faith community. So we can learn something about religious populations through this study. So there are two main questions I want to focus on in our presentation today. Firstly, how has the pandemic affected religiosity in faith communities? And secondly, how has the pandemic affected mental health and flourishing? So in terms of religiosity, we looked at 5 dimensions in particular: how often people attend religious services, their sense of connection or closeness to the local faith community, how often they pray or meditate, how often they read sacred texts or scriptures, and how important faith is to them in everyday life. And so in terms of attendance, of course, it is not surprising that there is a significant decline because many of these communities were not able to operate during the pandemic, especially during this time when we were conducting the survey. However, we see that about the same proportion of people say that their attendance has been the same since before the pandemic, and there's even a substantial minority who says that their attendance has increased. I'll say a little bit more about them. Similarly, with a sense of connection, more people say that their sense of connection has been pretty much the same than has declined. And for the other measures of religiosity, we see the vast majority saying there's been no change since the pandemic, and more have experienced increases in these aspects of religiosity than decreases. And so for populations that are already very active in their faith communities or were active before the pandemic, it seems that the religiosity overall has either remained the same or has increased because of the pandemic. Another question we wanted to look at was how the pandemic has affected desired future religious participation. So a number of faith leaders are concerned that with the inability to attend services, people are going to not want to return after the pandemic is over. So we asked people what their future intentions were, what they thought they would most likely do after the pandemic. And we found 2 main categories. One category is people who said they would most likely attend in-person religious services only after the pandemic. And these tended to be predominantly those whose attendance had decreased since the pandemic, those who couldn't continue going. However, there's another category who wanted to have a mix of online and in-person services after the pandemic, and most of them were folks whose religious service attendance had increased since the pandemic. So clearly this was a group who had started flocking to online services and classes. And when we conducted some further inquiry into this, we saw this was predominantly from our Reformed Jewish and Hindu communities in our studies. And when we talked to leaders of those communities, we found that they had considerably expanded their online classes and online services, and found they were getting people from all over the country, as well as even some from outside the US who were attending these classes. And so for some faith communities, it seems that the pandemic has offered them an opportunity to expand their reach. And certainly there are people whose attendance has increased since the pandemic, and we found in our analyses that many of them, their mental health was not as good, and so it seems that the stresses of the pandemic may be driving them towards religious participation, and therefore this new mode of online participation is a benefit for this contingent of people. Now let's move on to looking at mental health and flourishing during the pandemic. We measured mental health in a number of different ways. One is we looked at some standard validated scales of anxiety, depression, and anger. And so here, these are scales where 1 is very low and 5 is very high levels of anxiety, depression, and anger. And this is measured over the past 30 days from when they took the survey, and quite low levels across the board. But you can see some denominational differences. So in our sample, it's the Orthodox Jewish respondents who have the highest levels of anxiety and depression in particular, as well as some of the Catholic respondents, and the lowest levels are reported by the LDS participants. If we look at another measure of mental health, which is how would you rate your overall mental health on a scale of 0 to 10, we find some similar results. Overall high levels of mental health being reported, again with the Orthodox participants in our sample reporting lower levels than, say, the evangelical or LDS or African American Baptists or Hindus. We also look at overall human flourishing, and this is measured using something called the Harvard Flourishing Index. And this has 5 dimensions: happiness and life satisfaction, mental and physical health, a sense of meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. And so on this scale of combining these items 0 to 100, again, you see something very similar to the overall mental health measure, which is again the Orthodox Jewish community in our sample reporting lower levels, and the LDS and African American Baptists reporting the highest levels. And so what is happening here in the Orthodox Jewish communities, we have one of our panelists who will address this issue after my presentation. Now, one of the things we find in our analysis consistently is the factor that is most significantly associated with better mental health is the importance of religion in daily life. And so those for whom religion is the most important report significantly higher levels of mental health and overall flourishing compared to those for whom religion is not very important. We can see this across all levels of human flourishing on the Harvard flourishing scale. So the happiness and life satisfaction, mental and physical health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. The only dimension where there's no difference is the financial and material stability. We also looked at those who reported that since the pandemic, their mental health has worsened. And here we see again that those for whom faith is the most important report significantly lower. They're much less likely to report that their mental health has worsened compared to those for whom their faith is not that important. But then again, overall, only less than 20% of our sample says that their mental health has worsened since the pandemic. And keep in mind, again, 1 in 4 Americans have been experiencing significant mental health challenges since the pandemic. And so we find those who are more religious certainly are less likely to say that their mental health has worsened. And we also tried to look at other aspects of mental health, and we found that the one area where most people do report a significant deterioration of mental health is in feeling isolated from people one cares about, and that's close to 60% of our sample. But for all these other measures, feeling lonely, feeling helpless, mental health worsening that we just saw, and a sense of purpose in life having been weakened, a very small percentage of our sample reports these sorts of changes. Another thing we found in our analysis is that those who report a decline in religiosity since the pandemic have more than twice the odds of feeling isolated and lonely than respondents who did not report such a decline. We then also wanted to look at what faith communities and leaders have been doing. How have they been helpful? How have they been responding? And here we found that the majority of faith communities seem to be in regular contact with members. Faith community leaders have made themselves easy to access. Their faith community has provided help to people outside the community. The faith community has offered members help with financial needs, and the faith community has helped elderly members to stay connected. And so 60% or more of our respondents agree to these statements. And so it seems that faith leaders have been doing a good job overall responding. However, when it comes to mental health in particular, the response is not as strong. Only about 50% or so say that their faith community leaders have talked about mental health at all, and significantly fewer say that the faith community has provided external resources for mental health or promoted online support groups for mental health. And this latter factor is pretty important in our statistical analysis in predicting better mental health for people. So those communities where the community had promoted online support groups seem to do better in terms of mental health compared to those communities where such support groups were not promoted, net of other factors. We also found through conversations with leaders in our sample that most of them said they did not make additional mental health referrals since the pandemic, which we found somewhat surprising. Most of them did have to respond to the need for additional financial help, for help with food, for help with health-related resources, but they say not related to mental health referrals. And so we're not sure if it's because those who have had mental health needs did not turn to their faith leader, or if it's simply because in this population, They did not have a felt need for such referrals, or simply because the leaders were not able to recognize that a need presented to them required a mental health referral. We do not know. Another important factor we find is that sharing problems with others in the community is a vital ingredient of mental health and flourishing. And so this is a variable where we ask people, how frequently do they talk to others in their faith community about their private problems? Either never, once in a while, fairly often, or very often. And so the more frequently one shares problems with others in their faith community, the better their overall mental health, as well as all indicators of human flourishing, as you can see here. There are also very important denominational differences here, with the Jewish sample reporting relatively low levels of sharing private problems, and the African American participants reporting very frequent levels of sharing problems. Now, this is not just an artifact of the pandemic. We conducted surveys even before the pandemic, again, as I mentioned, between 2017 and 2019. And very similarly, we found both before and after during the pandemic, both times, less than 30% of participants reported sharing problems either fairly often or very often. So these top two categories together constitute less than 30% of the sample, both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And so there's something more we need to learn about obstacles to trust and vulnerability in faith communities, and what might account for some of these differences in cultures of faith communities, of congregations or denominations, in either fostering vulnerability and trust or inhibiting it. I want to close with a few other notable findings from our study. We found in our sample relatively low levels of what we would consider mental health stigma. So more than 90% of participants in our sample agree with the following statements. Having a mental health disorder is nothing to be ashamed of. People should not be ashamed to say a loved one died by suicide. People with mental health disorders can live normal lives. People with mental health disorders are welcomed in my faith community. So more than 90% of the sample agreed to these statements. We also found interesting responses to this question on, which is an indicator of mental health literacy, is who would people turn to when their loved one is experiencing a mental health concern? Now, this question is asked in different ways in the research. It is a common finding in previous research that Americans, when they experience a mental health concern, turn to faith leaders first. We wanted to ask, what if they're experiencing a serious mental illness and threatening to harm themselves or someone else? And here we found that more than 80% would either call 911 or call a mental health crisis line or consult a therapist or a mental health professional, and less than 45% would consult a faith leader. And we gave them a number of, they could choose from, many options. They could select all that applied. And so in that formulation of the question, less than 45% said they would consult a faith leader at all. And when we asked them who they would turn to first, 37% said they would call 911, 22% would call a crisis line, 11% a therapist or mental health professional, and only 2% would call a faith leader first. And so, so again, this is a little bit different from some of the other research that we have found in faith communities in the past on where people turn to when they experience mental health crises. We also asked about their beliefs about the COVID-19 virus and their responses to the pandemic and the general response to the pandemic. And so we found the vast majority supported wearing face masks in public, supported social distancing measures, trusted information from the scientific experts, and very few thought that COVID-19 was a bioweapon or that COVID-19 was a hoax. Hardly anybody thought it was a hoax. Some more mixed results about trust in the virus, information about the virus from the media. But overall, in terms of these other measures of responses to the pandemic, they were quite supportive. In terms of vaccine acceptance, we found some important racial differences, and in our sample, we found that African-American respondents said that they would be less willing to take a COVID-19 vaccine if it were made available compared to other respondents. However, it's important to keep in mind here that these are data from October to December of 2020, and things have likely changed since then. The interpretation of these findings, we control for religiosity in these tests. We also control for their trust in science, which tends to be pretty high across all racial groups. And so the interpretation is likely, this may likely be driven by some of the ongoing systemic racism in the medical field that African Americans experience. But that being said, we now also, since December, certainly have seen around the country African American churches taking a lead in vaccination efforts. And so one of our panelists, Elisa Gilmore, will speak to this as well. So in conclusion, what can we take away from these results? Let's first keep in mind the limitations of sample representativeness and the cross-sectional data. This is a snapshot from one point in time where we're not tracking respondents over time. And this is a sort of a more religiously active population that is also of higher income, higher education, and that tends to be older. So let's keep all that in mind. But overall, we do see very strong associations of religiosity with both mental health and overall flourishing, which has been confirmed in a lot of other research. Religiosity, we can see buffers against the stressful effects of the pandemic. For those who are active in their faith communities, we find that religiosity may be the same, if not increased, since the pandemic. And we also find that some communities are reaching new members who were not quite as religious before the pandemic. And then we also see the importance of leadership outreach in improving the mental health of members of faith communities. Our data also show low levels of mental health stigma, which is important for mental health professionals to note, as they can see religious communities as potential partners. However, we also saw low levels of referrals, which we need to better understand, as well as low levels of problem sharing, which may be indicative of low levels of trust and vulnerability, even among those who are very active in their faith communities. And that is something we need to better understand. Finally, we also saw the high approval levels of COVID-19 safety measures and vaccination. And this is important, again, because a number of people have expressed concern that religious communities may be driving some of the skepticism towards the vaccine or towards responses to COVID-19 in general. We do not find that overall in our data. So I want to close with thanking a number of my collaborators and research assistants, as well as project advisors on this project, without whom we would not be able to do this research. I also want to thank again the John Templeton Foundation for funding this study. The first phase of the study, which we started in 2017, looking at mental health and faith communities, was funded by the IHE Foundation. I'm very grateful for their support, and also the Institute for Human Ecology, who is hosting our webinar. I want to thank you all, and now turn the floor over to our panelists, starting with Professor Scott Thuma.
Well, thank you, Brandon. Quite interesting information and data, and it's clear that we live in interesting times, and even more so if one's a religion researcher. Rapid changes were already taking place on the religious landscape prior to the pandemic, but were greatly sped up by the events of the last 18 months. Any change creates stress and some mental distress, but from our research here at the Institute, and I think in some of your data, the staggering amount of change that has been affected onto most U.S. congregations during the pandemic, even if they're doing positive adaptations, has been anxiety producing, certainly for the clergy and also I think for lay members, to a pretty monumental degree. And so, some of the relatively positive and lack of mental distress that you found even 6 months ago speaks pretty highly to the adaptive behavior of congregations and faith communities, and the importance of that community support. But it's also clear that, based on your data, that not all congregations have felt this equally, and it's true that the stress is positively mediated by having a religious connection. So in some sense, the picture that the data paints is very similar to what we're seeing at our research at the Hartford Institute. And especially in terms of if there's diminished attendance, there's increased isolation, loss of community, and that brings in then stress and mental health questions. I also have to echo I have done many quite a few surveys of attenders in congregations, and the sample that you found is very similar in terms of demographics to what we found. And I'm to the point of calling that a nationally representative sample of congregational members because it's almost always looks like that. You know, one of the other interesting things that I think came up in your data for me was that question about how much your religiosity was going to increase in the future. And for those folks who said it was going to increase, it was pretty clear that quite a few of them wanted both face-to-face and online ways of worshiping. You said that it was mostly Hindu and Jewish, but honestly, in my world, which is mostly Christian, Protestant, I hear this often from the clergy and also from attenders that there is this strong push now, once the pandemic is waning, to not just go back to face, and I think it's really an interesting dynamic that those who were less networked to the congregation prior to the pandemic, but have come to appreciate the positive effects of religion, are finding the online participation a good way to enter into the community and gain some of its benefits, and won't like it if that goes away. I think that in fact they may actually drop back off if that goes away. You know, much of what I do at Hartford Seminary and what our research center is about is mostly looking at religious leaders. We're a seminary, and so we train religious leaders. And one of the things that we've recently done is interview young, creative clergy. And so I wanted to offer a few of their comments to put some words, I think, to some of the data that your study hints at. First, we get a lot of comments from our clergy that show tremendous optimism of response to the pandemic. One of the pastors said, "Let it never be said that the church cannot change quickly." Well, it was always said that the church couldn't change quickly, but I think there is an optimism. And another one said, "I feel like as a church we have won the pandemic." You know, and so I think there's a real optimism there. But we also hear from other clergy some mixed emotions, kind of reframing the lemons into lemonade sort of thing. One said, "As much as I didn't want disruption for the most part, I framed this as a season of opportunity mentally, as an opportunity to test out new things that we should have been doing anyway." Or another said, I think we have to rethink our entire jobs in response to this." This is a pretty stressful time for clergy. Your data says that they are doing well in responding to the members, but I think that that's coming at a pretty significant cost for them and also for the other lay leaders in the congregation. They're working hard. They're working overtime in many ways. And then we've heard lots of stories from clergy of tremendous stress and exhaustion. Many of them are in many ways facing sort of burnout as the pandemic months have dragged on. One said to us, "It really does feel like, what am I doing this anymore? People are awful. My job is not what I thought it would be." Another one demonstrated the fatigue that comes after a year full of trying to innovate, and said, "This right now feels like more work than it did last March. Last March, people had more grace. At the beginning, they were grateful for anything I could do. Now they're saying, why aren't you continuing to up the game?" You know, so just at a time when they're quite exhausted after a year, the people's expectation have risen as the professionalism has changed. So, you know, congregational leadership, and I include their lay leadership too, is never stress-free, but this has become simultaneously a moment of compulsory innovation and a moment of great fatigue from all the change. So, I mean, I think the research that we hear from you is critical. Religious attendance, involvement, spiritual worldviews are all strongly correlated with positive mental health and flourishing. But the pandemic's effects are not going to happen overnight, and they're not soon to go away like maybe our masks have, which is part of the reason why I have a new research project that's going to go over 5 years. I think a lot of the effects that we're going to see are, I put in the category of long haul, that in fact, the implications of some of what's happened during the pandemic is going to continue to be with us over the next several years, which means that the stress that congregations, congregational leaders, and even attenders are feeling isn't going to be immediately over once everybody gets back into the church. There's still going to be issues around funding. There's still going to be issues around who's not there, issues around who no longer is here because they've deceased. There's all sorts of other stressors, I think, that the congregation is going to have to respond to in order to come out of this truly healthier and in more flourishing than they were before. So that's enough for me now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. And I look forward to learning more from your research and collaborating with you. Elisa, I'd like to invite you to respond next.
Thank you, Dr. Brandon, and congratulations on the successful completion of this insightful research. To address your research and what it shows in reference to African American Baptist churches having a significantly higher level of problems sharing than other communities, it's if I had to just sum it up, it would be because it's a safe place. As we all know, it's no surprise that African Americans have a great deal of mistrust between the government officials, police officers, doctors, even teachers to a certain extent, because they feel certain groups do not have their best interest in mind. Additionally, due to systemic racism and oppression that has occurred since slavery, the Black church has been that safe haven for those experiencing challenges and trauma, and where people of color will go for healing, prayers, and support, and share at a point where they know that it won't be held against them. And I'll say, in regards to COVID and there being a vaccine hesitancy in the African American community, our pastor made it a point to bring Dr. Wright himself, who is an African American male and the CEO of the University of Maryland Medical System, to come and to share at 2 Bible studies. We didn't have Bible study. We allowed him to come and to address the fact that we had a captive audience at that time, to address the truth about the vaccine during a time when there was conflicting messages put out. And this was extremely helpful, and people within the congregation was able to chat and ask questions directly to Dr. Wright and have him dispel all the untruths and just, kind of help with the fear that they were having in wanting to receive the vaccine. Our church did partner with the University of Maryland Medical System, and our Family Life Center became a vaccine site, which went from offering vaccines from 2 days a week to 5 days a week, where today we have given close to 40,000 vaccines. And what's different about this was administered, the shots were by volunteers who were members of the church. This was volunteers of people within the community. So it was faces that they felt comfortable in seeing. To give further insight about our church in particular and some others, we have a number of ministries which focuses on specific problems or life challenges that individuals may experience. To give you an idea, We have ministries to address grief, and there's been a lot of grief as a result of COVID. We've lost members of our church. We've had members who've lost multiple members of their family. We have ministries to tackle the challenges that a woman may even feel in the guilt and the effect of an abortion decision. We cater to those who may be diagnosed with cancer or Alzheimer's, or those caring for them. In reference to domestic violence, we not only minister to women and children, but also men. We forget that men suffer from domestic violence as well. We have ministries that promote the spiritual healing to overcome sexual abuse, to help those trying to overcome life-controlling problems such as substance abuse, anger, and addiction, and ministries that even empower teen parents to make healthy decisions about relationships, sex, parenting, and their future life endeavors. We have one ministry that aids in the spiritual healing and growth of people who are currently struggling with or have previously experienced unwanted same-sex attraction. Okay, so even prior to COVID, individuals were dealing with a number of mental health challenges as a whole, and how we addressed that was catering to the specific problem. So we do have the mental health support ministry, which offers encouragement, spiritual support, education, and training to individuals who experience mental illnesses and to those who have loved ones who are experiencing mental health challenges. And our goal always is to help to remove the stigma. So we stress to clergy, individuals, families, ministries, and even other churches that mental illness is not due to a lack of faith, a character flaw, personal or spiritual weakness, and not everything can be prayed away or demonized. But what we do is, because we are a church, we point them to biblically based and evidence-based sources that can help them. We did this pre-COVID, we'll do this post-COVID, and when COVID hit, we didn't miss a beat. We just continued with our ministry on Zoom. And our overall goal is to help people not just survive, but to cope and to thrive in the midst of or in spite of having mental health challenges. So I said that just for you to see that, as you can probably see, that it's not often easy for someone to talk about these issues, okay? So initially and it's primarily due to the association, being associated with stigma. Okay, so we make sure that ministry environment is one that's safe, that it's peaceful, there's no judgment, and it's healthy. And because of that, it becomes a haven where the person can come and share, learn, and lean on one another and receive help during difficult times. And this allows participants to gain the trust with one another and learn to be open about their past experiences or what they're experiencing. And what we find is later on, they have a desire to become equipped to, as we call, minister or serve and educate others. We also make it clear, which many of the ministries do, how important confidentiality is. And we do not allow what we call intruders to come in to simply listen in to everyone else share what they may say they dirty, the dirt in their house, all right, okay? But they can't come meeting after meeting and not share, because it is important for everyone to share and to participate and contribute and add to the conversation, because we all know that we all learn and grow from the strength and courage of others' experiences. So as I wrap up, I just want to say that last night we had 35 individuals attend our mental health support ministry, and we had a few new people, and we always hear the same thing, that they felt comfortable in sharing. And this is simply because we have created an environment that encourages openness, honesty, transparency, there's vulnerability, and the reliance on others in the community, meaning our ministries and small groups, of whom they can trust, who look like them, who can relate with what they're dealing with, and they don't have to worry about it being said outside the group due to the accountability and agreements that's made, because we purposely structure it to be a safe environment for people to share their problems. So we are strategic and intentional about ensuring that to be the case. Okay, thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate what you shared and all the great work you're all doing. Lisa, I'd like to invite you to respond.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be here today to represent the Jewish community, and also slightly daunted because that is pretty much an impossible task. So I hope to be able to shed light onto some of the survey findings from the perspective of the Jewish community. And I find this conversation fascinating. I also serve on the FaithNet advisory, national advisory group for the for NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness. And so much of our work, even though our observances are different, helping our people and serving our congregations, there are so many similarities and so much we have to learn from each other. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this community in this conversation. I just want to add that I think one of the biggest silver linings of COVID, it's both a blessing and a curse, is that mental health is now part of the everyday conversation. Mental health used to be, prior to COVID, I would say, almost like cancer was, a decade or so ago. People wouldn't even say the word out loud. They would whisper it, "Oh yes, cancer," or just call it the C word. So now mental health is really out of the shadows to some degree. Not just in the Jewish community, I'll speak specifically to the Jewish community, but overall, issues and diagnosis specifically like depression and anxiety are now much more receptive to having those conversations in public. When it comes to other mental health diagnosis like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, I think there is still a lot of stigma and shame to discussing those conditions openly. I was surprised with the survey findings that 90% of the survey respondents reported having no shame or stigma associated with mental health. In the Jewish community, that is certainly not what we have found. In fact, many of the other faith-based communities have a go-to organization for mental health related to their faith. The Jewish community really does not. We have a lot of Jewish organizations doing many different little things in niche areas that are very valuable. And 2 years ago, my nonprofit organization, it's called the bluedovefoundation.org. You can find it at thebluedovefoundation.org. We are positioning ourselves to be the go-to resource, really the first point of contact for mental health within the Jewish community. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we do want to have sort of a one-stop shop that both Jews and non-Jews can turn to as a resource related to Jewish mental health issues. So our mission is, number one, to increase education and reduce the stigma associated with mental health within the Jewish community and beyond. And it's a big task. So I speak to this professionally from the Blue Dove Foundation's perspective, as well as personally. Everybody associated with this from the Blue Dove Foundation and the Jewish mental health space has been impacted personally by mental health in one way or another. My family went through a significant mental health crisis when my daughter had acute depression, was unable to continue at her Jewish day school, required hospitalization and serious intensive treatment. Now, thank God, she says her resting face is a smile. So we are really in a great place. And I will tell you, I was part of the 2% that the first person that my husband and I turned to was our rabbi. He was really our rock, in addition to my mother, who was really the rock of the family. But he really provided amazing support for us in the smallest of ways. He would text me, once a week or so. "Hi, Lisa, how's your daughter? What can I do to help?" And I know that is a gift, and that is an expectation. We can't expect every clergy person to do that. But at the time of crisis, it was incredibly important. During COVID, it's impossible for a clergy to do that because the number of families that really need mental health support has increased exponentially within our community, and I imagine within most all of the communities. I would like to just speak to some of the survey findings and help to frame the conversation between the Reformed community findings and the Orthodox community findings. And speaking as an Orthodox Jewish woman, I should put that out there just so you know where I come from, but I'm going to speak to the entire, or try to speak to the entire spectrum of the Jewish community, because as you all are well aware, we have Jewish members of our community that identify as Jewish or are completely secular to ultra-Orthodox. And I think from the survey findings, we found anecdotally that what we're seeing in our communities matches up with the survey findings. In the Reform and the conservative movements, again, generally speaking, religious observance increased, and Zoom was an incredible tool to reach community members who normally may not have walked into the building, but were hungry for that support from their communities, from their friends, not only from a religious standpoint, but from a social standpoint. I will tell you also, with the survey results being skewed a little bit to a more senior age population, many of them were isolated. So having that social connection was critically important. My own mother, who would go to services occasionally, would Zoom every Friday night in front of her computer and see her friends and enjoy the music and really get that spiritual uplift. It will be fascinating in terms of what happens after COVID. We are thinking it will probably be more of a hybrid model because people are still hungry for that type of information. So having the remote access to religion for the Reform and Conservative was fantastic. From the Orthodox perspective, that was impossible. Because for holiday observance in the synagogue, for the Sabbath and for holidays, we do not use technology. So from sundown on Friday night until an hour after sundown on Saturday night, when the services are going on, and on Jewish holidays, it's impossible for us to use Zoom because we don't go to those services. Whereas the Reform and Conservative, during Passover, they had Zoom Seders, as we nicknamed them. So there were a lot of great opportunities to connect and be innovative and be creative. So I do want to just shed light on one other piece of information from the Orthodox perspective, and really highlight for both this survey and future surveys the importance of community for religious Jews, or specifically for Orthodox Jews. There, we gather together, and in fact, there are certain prayers that can only be said if there is a quorum, what we call a minyan, or 10 Jewish men who can say those prayers. And it's critically important during COVID. For example, if you've lost a close loved one, you say a certain prayer, a Kaddish prayer for a year, 3 times a day, you go to pray and say that prayer. We couldn't do that in person inside the building, but many synagogues were incredibly creative and had services outside under tents, etc. So it's really just a great testament to the creativity of our rabbis and our leaders who were able to make that happen. I would just like to go back quickly, because I know we are on a time frame here, to talk about some of the shame and stigma that does exist within mental health. During COVID, in very painful ways, it has changed some of the conversations around mental health. In the Atlanta Jewish Orthodox community, there was a tragic event just maybe 2 months ago where a congregant ended his life by suicide inside of the synagogue building. And so that has changed the conversation and really highlighted the need to have better understanding of mental health issues. There's still a long way to go and a lot of education that needs to happen within the Jewish community, and we are working on it. We are slower to work on it than maybe other faiths have been to have those conversations, but it is really a priority to work on it, and there are many in the Jewish community who are really making a difference, especially our teens our teens are getting the most support and are really leading the way in a lot of ways. So thank you for this opportunity. I'd just like to close for a moment as we come out of the pandemic, and at this moment in time, that we all pray for peace within our hearts, within our homes, in Israel, and for the world. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Lisa. Very grateful. Mark, last but not least, I'd like to invite you to respond. And I'm sorry we're close to time, but hopefully we can all stay a few more minutes for Q&A after. And a number of great questions have come in, so we'll try to take as many of your questions as we can.
Thank you, Brandon. And I'll actually try to keep my comments real short so that we'll have some time for Q&A. I was really, I appreciate the data you reported. It's like Scott said, it's quite consistent with some of the research that I've been involved in and have come across as a psychologist who studies religion and mental health. Just a few quick observations. The point you make about faith being good for mental health is actually part of a broader point that faith is good for health in general. There's an old study, 22 years old now, tucked away in a little obscure journal called Demography, but it's a pretty good study that shows, and this was with Christian congregations, but it showed people that go to church live 8 years longer than people who don't. And that was even after controlling for behavioral variables like alcohol use and smoking. So there's something about faith that promotes health in general, including mental health. So I just was glad that that came out. That always surprises me too, that it doesn't get more attention. If something like lowering cholesterol or exercise or gratitude practices get so much attention, why is it that we don't talk about the health promoting effects of faith? Second observation, again, I'll be brief on this, but it just came across my desk a couple of weeks ago that the Gallup polls are now reporting that for the first time since they started collecting the data in the 1930s, that less than half of the members of the United States are members of faith communities. It's down to 47% now. They started in the 1930s. The percentage of people who belong to a faith community was about 70%. And it really stayed that way through all of the 20th century, up and down a few percentage points. And then when the century turned, so did the graph. And you see this sort of precipitous falling to the point where now less than 50% of people are members of faith communities. You could argue that we're becoming a post-religious society, perhaps, but it's also interesting to me that still half of the people in our country, almost half, do belong to faith communities. So it's still very important research that you're doing, and I think it's important that we continue looking at this. Third, less than 30% talk with others in their faith community about their problems. That was from some older research you mentioned, Brandon. I was a little surprised it was that high, and I was actually happy it was, especially in I'm sure there's interesting cultural differences there, but in a society that is dominated by a sort of individualist, especially a vertical individualist kind of mindset, it's not too surprising to me that that's a low percentage, and I was glad to see that there was 30%. And then the fourth and final thing I'll say is, and we didn't see this data very specifically, but it occurs to me that evangelicals may not be as anti-vaccine as we might guess from the media attention. Now, I realize you are looking at a particular subset of folks from the DC, Maryland area. It'd be fascinating to know if the Texas respondents look different. It'd also be fascinating to know if white evangelicals look different than other evangelicals. But again, much of the media attention is showing them not being in favor of vaccines, but I don't know how much of that's based on careful data collection either. So thanks, I appreciate the chance to respond, and I'm looking forward to some time for question and answers too.
Fantastic, thank you, Mark. Okay, wow, so a lot of great questions here. Let me try to get through some of them, and I might pass some of them on to our panelists who may be better equipped to answer them than I am. So one question is, given the stigma of mental health that is still very much part of society and influence on honest self-reporting, I'm wondering how the faith community leaders plan to address the needs for the many folks too shy to admit that they're struggling. Research shows how underreported mental health issues are are given the perceived stigma. And I think this is really an important point, because it may just be that the reason many of our leaders were not making more mental health referrals is because people were, unable to, unwilling to approach them for whatever reason. So I do think it's important for leaders to do some more outreach. I think the kinds of initiatives that we're seeing in Elisa's congregation, where there are committees and there are groups, so it's not necessarily the onus being on the leaders, but on lay leaders and on groups that are organized to do some outreach. I mean, that might be a more effective model. I wonder if our panelists have any thoughts on that, because it just may be that the leaders are themselves overburdened by having to deal with the rising number of funerals and the complications of trying to manage how to respond to people, financial needs, et cetera. And so whether there are other ways in which they can do mental health outreach that need to be adopted. Scott, do you have a quick thought on that?
Yeah, Brandon, one of the things that we haven't talked much about, but is certainly absolutely an important dynamic, is the size of congregations. I think the effects on religious communities has been increasingly exacerbated by the size. The smaller the congregation, the more impacted it has been in many ways. Because much of the work, I mean, the small size goes along with older population of congregation members, usually somewhat isolated from the social dynamics and the power elite within the community, those kinds of things. And therefore, more of the weight is on the leader if there are only 40 people in the congregation or something, and most of them are over the age of 70, and also not technologically adept. So I mean, there are complications, and the vast majority of congregations in the country are small, below 65. So in fact, I mean, I think in a congregation like Elisa's of 10,000, there is already a cadre of very well-trained lay leaders. In a small congregation, I think it really behooves the leadership to think about not how do they empower their own people, but how do they connect with the other networks of support groups in a community. So it's much more a network model rather than a kind of train up our individual lay people. At least that's what we try to train some of our small church pastors.
Yeah, that's something really crucial given the sort of the burnout, right? So it's not even for pastors, but even lay leaders in smaller churches, I think, are feeling overwhelmed because they have to volunteer for this on top of all of their other commitments. And imagine having children and dealing with, I don't know, virtual schooling and all of that stuff on top of everything else, right? So so definitely, I think some sort of network model would be important to figure out how to facilitate that and make that happen. And I wonder if there are organizations that might be able to help faith communities with this. A couple of other questions are, if congregations are waiting to reopen, are there actions they should consider in the meantime to prepare for when they can open again? So yeah, this is a really good question as to what, I mean, I do think, again, outreach is really crucial on the part of faith leaders, but more than just leaders, I think people who are active in faith communities need to move from perhaps, expecting something to be done for them and instead participate themselves in doing some outreach. And that is certainly happening, in a lot of faith communities. I wonder, either Lisa or Elisa, if you have any thoughts on what congregations could do as they're waiting to reopen, if that's not happened yet.
I would just like to speak to that from what we've observed in the Jewish community, not just what congregations can do as they reopen, but the mental health implications of people within our communities that are really not on the same page. We have seen the mental health issues specifically impact our children both in our Jewish day schools, as well as our synagogue members in general, who their family may be doing something different than another family. Their classmates may be doing something different, as in who's getting vaccinated, who's wearing masks, who's continuing to do virtual school, who's going in person, who's going to the grocery store, who's still ordering online, and then sort of is there a right or wrong? And those differences and those uncertainties are continuing to create some mental health stresses for people. And within my own block, I live in an extremely Jewish Orthodox neighborhood. I can count 3 different synagogues within a 2-minute walk from my front door. And each of those are doing different things. Some have taken off masks completely. Some have a little tent still in the parking lot for people who aren't comfortable going in the building. Some are still requiring masks. So the mask politics, if you will, has gotten meshed up with where you actually go to pray, or if you're going to pray. And there's, some social pressures regarding that. I think most of our clergy, if I can generalize, are ready to get back to business. They want to be at the pulpit. They want to be things back to normal, quote unquote. I think it's more realistic to think what's forward to normal, what's going to be our new normal going forward. And I still think it's going to be a bit of a hybrid.
If I can address that in reference to our church, our pastor has made a decision that we are not going to go back to church until there's herd immunity and we all can go together. He does not want to take it upon himself to decide who can come and who can't come. So we're still going to wait for that to happen. But what we have done to ensure that there's still connection, which helps with the overall mental health of our members, is that we have had a tremendous number of drive-bys. We celebrate birthdays. We celebrate, one of our deacons finished his last chemo, and we all went and blowing the horns and signs and cards and you name it. So that's what we've done. We've even done where members can pick up their communion. Yes, you can have your own communion, but it's just another way to gather together. We have met in parks. Different ministries are walking together. So it's overall, even though we're not together, we still feel connected in a number of ways. Yes, we all are Zoomed out. We all have the Zoom fatigue, but we still are celebrating. Take, for instance, before service, our services, the deacons and the deaconess and some ministers would gather together prior to the service, each service that we have, and gather and pray. We see family members. We still do that on Zoom. So, this is helping our mental health as a whole when we're able to see faces. And that's one reason when we gather for ministries, we ask that they turn on the cameras, because just to see a face, to see a smile, to hear your voice and not look at a blank screen, you don't have that connection. So these are some of the things that we're encouraged to do, that we love doing, and it seems to be working until we can get back into the church. Also, our pastor, he preaches from the church, but we have a Zoom audience. So you can get on the Zoom audience, and after the Zoom the service is completed, our pastor greets, answers any questions. So there's still a connection, which he needs. He even says when we first started off, when he had to preach, it was very odd. And most pastors were feeling, okay, I'm here, we're here, it's live stream, but nobody's saying amen. He doesn't see a face, and it was very odd. And so we did move to a Zoom audience, so he can have that connection. And so we do that for our pastor, so he's not preaching to just an empty sanctuary.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think it's really crucial, even as we come out of the pandemic. Sure, our mask restrictions are being lifted, and it's summer, and we're gonna, I think, we get a bit of an emotional boost from that. But let's not forget our need for connection, and let's not take for granted, the extent to which people, I think, are still experiencing the trauma and the burnout and the fatigue, of this pandemic. It's important to reach out, and faith communities have a crucial role. Let me see in the last couple of minutes if I can answer just a couple of more questions. So one is, are there plans to study the mental health of our faith leaders? They've endured all types of stress, loneliness, financial, accompanying people who are dying, etc. So yes, it is very crucial. Scott, I know that you are working on a national study of how congregations, including faith leaders, are coming out of the pandemic, and there is going to be a mental health component to that. Another question is that the slides didn't include non-religious groups. Has any research examined how these groups have weathered COVID-19 compared to religious groups? So I do think that is an important thing in light of what Mark said earlier, that there are fewer and fewer people belonging to religious communities. So what are they doing? What is community like? What is connection? What does that look like outside the spaces of faith communities? I'm not aware of any research of that sort. Mark, would you have any thoughts on whether there might be alternatives that folks who are not part of faith communities could benefit from, or are there ways in which faith communities can in some way reach out to those who are perhaps not part of faith communities and not part of those communities without any kind of requirement for them to join, but just in terms of just realizing the mental health benefits of community and of this sort of support?
Yeah, the final thing I was about to say, I really don't have a lot of suggestions, but I agree that it's something that we need to research more. But the final thing you said, Brandon, what a beautiful opportunity for faith communities to reach out into communities, not for the sake of growing or proselytizing, but just for the sake of being present. And if I could use the language of God being present through the faith community for the sake of the world, that's just a beautiful sort of possibility, it seems to me. But I don't have like a list of exemplars to identify. I'm sure there are communities that are doing this, but I appreciate the way you frame that.
Thank you. Well, perhaps we could end on that note then, in terms of encouraging faith communities to, certainly build trust and vulnerability and connection with each other, to support not just their members, but also their leaders, but then also to turn outward and exist for the world in order to really support those who are struggling in serious ways during this time. Thank you all so much. I do not take your time for granted, and I really appreciate your participation. There's more links here about the Institute for Human Ecology and the other work we've done, as well as the John Templeton Foundation. Please feel free to follow up with myself or any of our panelists on the work that we're doing. A heartfelt thanks to all of you, and wishing you all the best.